Yeah. All right, we are back. Yeah. Check. Check 1, 2, 3. We're here. We got the camera fixed up. Let's go ahead up and get the check. Yeah. Yep. Let's go ahead on and just give a couple more seconds to let people filter in. I'm gonna do a couple more checks.
Natoka ndani ya nyumba nikimeremeta kama nyota, unaweza kwa kipofu usiangalie bota, kutoka juu mpaka chini nimevaa heel, figa marashi ya polo, kwa hivyo vizuri nanukia. Gari ni 504 tomana mtontonto, fungua dirisha jo, kuna chontonto, mpaka wapi leo bro, badala ya kengele samalizia kanivo, osa nimekuja kupati fungua mlango jo, leo ni leo, asema ya kesho ni mongo, acha kuongea mob, nipe chupa mbili za temo, nioneshe upendo leo asemaye kesho ni Mungu. Leo asemaye kesho ni Mungu. Excuse me, mbona wataka kutuua na mazishi plani kuja waita toti tatu za sambuka, na kama kawaida mbili sambuka za malkia mwenye kutembea utafikiria na viuno viwili. Jina langu ni Isa, mimi wananiita Amina, jina lako nimelisikia mahali wa some very familiar, ni lazima umenisikia kwa radio, Kiss Capital Nation na pia Metro, naweza kwa mafuta ukiishiwa na petrol, msea kwa kikumiza Isa ndo detol, leo ni leo kwa hivyo mbona ngoje kesho. Leo asemaye kesho ni Mungu. Leo asemaye kesho ni Mungu. Kama unataka kimekushika, ningependa ukaribie speaker, ongeza volume. Kama uko ndani ya club, iwe mamba, kani, pavement au club yoyote.
Yeah, welcome back to DiasporUS, man. This is episode 2. We are gonna go ahead on and get ready to call up the prof. You know what I'm saying? Leo. I'm a little sick, so please bear with me. I'm under the weather. Man, shout out to Ogopa DJs. I hope y'all don't hit me with the copyright strike. I had to play my jam just to get started. But you know, last episode we had such a fruitful conversation with the professor. You know, we talked a lot about Traore. We talked a lot about you know, the democratic quote unquote milieu that is been present in terms of you know, how West Africa has been progressing, but the weather has quite literally changed, right? The weather is so different. There are hundreds, thousands of people dying. They are hurting. Kenya is flooding. Other countries are flooding. And, you know, it seems to be that there's such a lack in response, not just in timing, but in, you know, resources and protocol, right? And that was something that made me kind of, you know, think, right? We saw Hurricane Katrina down south in you know, in New Orleans here in America, but what I'm seeing there, the images are almost no different other than the amount of wind destruction and other things that occurred there. But as far as the flooding, how many people are displaced, we're seeing such a large number. And I don't think that it's comparable in terms of death toll, but I do think that the damage to property and the response time is causing a similar issue as it pertains to how the people are solving the problems that is being caused by the water. So, today we're gonna have a little interesting topic to discuss, and we're gonna tap into some of the reasons as to why the infrastructure or the emergency protocol is lacking, and this kind of sheds a little bit of a light on how many issues there are in the infrastructure in Africa, among various countries, even a country like Kenya, which is considered among the most developed. I think it was rated the fourth most, behind uh, city, at least Nairobi city being the fourth most developed behind Lagos, Johannesburg, and I believe it was a city in either Angola. I think it was Angola, but it's fourth, right, in its development. So, without further ado, let's dive right into this. Let's go ahead on and give the professor a call, and see, where his head is at with this, because I really want to get his opinion. And looking forward to, hopefully, shout out to the diplomat, right? Shout out to Uncle, shout out to all of my other people who just feed me with so much knowledge. And I look forward to having you all on the guest streams as well. So let's go ahead on and give the prof a call, right? Hello.
Hello?
Hey, Sasa.
It,
So this is Professor Kari Kyle Francis Odiambo, all right? The one and the only, the professor, aka Pops. Um, I've been talking to the audience a little bit about the flooding that's going on in Kenya, and the response time. And there's several elements in the diaspora that have heard of what's going on, but they are not necessarily uh well aware or well informed about the elements surrounding the context and the weather patterns that are normally there, and what other things are in play for such situations like this. So can you talk a little bit about that in before we really dive into it? Is it the rainy season? Is it typically like this around this time in Kenya? What's the weather like?
yeah, thank you. I think we need to have something very clear
Uh-huh.
that we have not had the kind of rains and the kind of rainfall we are experiencing.
Mhm.
I don't think the country has experienced it since I was probably a child.
Wow.
That is 40, 50 years, yes.
So you're
So,
saying for the past 50 years you haven't seen rains like this. So this is completely out of the
no,
ordinary.
yes, this is completely out of the ordinary.
Got you.
I was talking to a friend of mine from Kitui,
Uh-huh.
a place that receives probably 4 to 5 inches of rain a year. What they have been getting in one day for the last probably 20 days is more than they normally receive in a year.
Wow.
So we're talking of amounts and an extent. This is probably the first time that probably every part of Kenya is raining heavily. It is the first time that every single dam in Kenya is full.
Wow.
So we are talking of extraordinary amounts of rainfall.
Wow.
So even if the decision makers would have been prepared for an emergency, I don't think any of them would have foreseen this kind of rainfall. That notwithstanding, the country is just never prepared for any emergencies.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. So it's actually a very difficult thing to plan for, because something like this has never been seen before.
I mean, this would fit the legendary rainfalls. In the olden days, you'd hear people say, I was born in the floods of. So this one would have gone in history as one of those landmark floods that the country has experienced.
Wow. You know, there's something crazy, right? So I'm sharing with the audience right now this article that is from today, where it says that 169 people have died due to the heavy rains and 91 people are missing, according to the latest government figures, right? Um, and more than 100, the rain has displaced more than 190,000 people, right? So that's upwards of a 250,000 people that, you know, are displaced, and that doesn't count the damaged roads and other infrastructure, right? So, you
Yes.
know, down to this particular point, um although, you know, there may not be a kind of how do I say, although there may not be an infrastructure to help the emergency right now, what are some of the things that used to suffice prior to this, you know, anomaly of heavy rainfall as emergency relief during like a rainy season or a flood? Was it those dams that you mentioned, or were there any cultural things that tribes that lived in lower lands did, or something that the people already prepped for? What how were these systems in place prior to a day like this?
Let's change the question slightly. Rains like this, when they came, they found a landscape that was natural. Like, for example, rivers had natural courses that they used to follow. So there wasn't as much of the overflow as we experience now because of modernity and also because of lack of planning or very poor planning. Let's take Nairobi, for example. Nairobi has natural rivers. Or, to put it correctly, Nairobi had natural rivers. There were places where, when it rained, water would flow to go wherever water goes to. But we have put buildings in these riparian lands. We've put buildings in waterways such that when it rains significantly like now, the water has nowhere to go. Those natural waterways are gone. So you find water now starts collecting in places that it never used to. Or water is forced to look for alternative routes to go to where water used to go to. So you see this excessive damage to property, extensive damage to infrastructure is the result of the fact that those places where water would have normally just passed to go to wherever water goes, it can't do that. Secondly, even where it is able to flow, it cannot flow completely, so it has to accumulate some point. When it cannot go wherever it wants to go to, it floods, it damages whatever is forcing it not to go where it wants to go. So as it tries to find its way out, that is when you experience these extensive damages.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So these waterways, right? Um, that kind of protected or gave the water a way to flow. Um, what what bureau regulates building on such ground in Kenya? Is there a regulatory body that protects such things from happening? Like there, I know there are here, right, where before you build anything, you have to ensure that it's quote unquote up to code, not necessarily just on an infrastructure, basis, but also on a location basis. Um, are there current government systems that prevent people from building on sites like these?
Well, when you talk of government preventing people from doing it, we need to unpack that. Of course, every city is managed by city managers, whether that is within an elected body like the county government or it is through executive orders. There is always a regulatory body, but corruption limits or corruption enables people to construct in places that are not supposed to or should not have been constructed on. So there's so much corruption that you can literally build right on top of a dam or right on top of a river or anywhere you can get space, irrespective of whether there is a code that says you can't do it. Because as long as the regulatory body has given you a license and a permit to do it, you go ahead and do it. There is secondly also grabbing of public lands, especially lands that were meant to construct roads, lands that were set aside for construction of utilities like sewer lines, like even now allowing the waters to flow. All these are regulated by the cities, by the towns, by the councils, but through corruption, you can get a permit to construct whatever you want.
I understand. So, corruption seems to be a common theme when discussing not just Kenyan politics, but politics in general. So, it's not something that's specific to Africa, but when it comes to times like this that are quite catastrophic, to be honest, um, I'm reading here that an article that's stating Ruto is asking for the uh, evacuation of riverside dwellers, right? But the question is, where would these people go, right? Um, are you familiar with Kenya's infrastructure when it comes to emergency relief? Uh, is there a system in place as such for natural disasters or for you know terrorism or things like that, where that there's already a um, protocol in place where either the army comes in or the Red Cross, or what kind of aid systems are currently in place that you're familiar with to deal with issues like this?
I mean, there is none, because any money that is normally set aside for any form of emergency, that is just another opportunity for the managers of that fund and those in government setting it aside just to line up their pockets. A while ago, in fact, there were billions that were set aside and distributed to the counties for in anticipation for El Nino rains, which never came. That money just went into people's pockets. In fact, if you've been reading about Nairobi, the governor, Sakaja, was bragging just a few months earlier that he had bought boats, boats for Nairobi City in anticipation of floods. And then, unfortunately, when it floods, the boats are not anywhere to be seen. The money was spent, but nothing was put in place in preparation for an emergency like what there is today.
So, what then are individuals supposed to do, right? Where because this is essentially natural disasters are essentially why where governments can actually be the most useful, right? Of immediate use to a group of people who would be otherwise, um, you know, very helpless on their own, right? So a natural disaster is actually a time for a government to, to shine, in essentially, in theory. Uh, why is it that these particular issues are not catalysts for individuals to take action on a certain level? Last week we talked about capturing the peasant. What is an individual supposed to do during a time like this where their entire livelihood may be either ruined, put on pause, or both? And the government has already eaten all the money. What are people to do?
Well, nothing. And it's good you are linking it with our last week's episode. Remember, I told you that there are things that democracies are completely helpless and hopeless in solving. This is one of those cases because in a place like Kenya and mostly African countries where democracy has not been fully embraced and where governments come to power through some electoral process or quasi-electoral processes, and where elections are very closely contested such that there is not an outright winner, you find the government in power becomes extremely weak to do anything because those who support it are weak and the opposition is strong enough to stonewall any attempt by the government to do anything. So a government that has only probably 50 point something percent support can hardly undertake any serious governance issue because doesn't have that support. That is the basis upon which I say I'm more comfortable with a dictatorship, because a dictatorship that is strong enough to subdue the population, when things like this happen, it is, number one, capable of moving people to higher grounds. It is capable of mobilizing by force if it is so required.
Uh-huh.
It is capable of putting in place systems that can manage at least some of these emergencies, including even just having the resources to do it, because
Right.
it doesn't have to go through any formal channels,
And
any established channels of getting money and shifting money from one expenditure to another.
that makes perfect sense. We actually have a question in the comments. Shout out Arita. He's asking, what's the role of government in such calamities, right? So while we expand on that, can you actually explain what is the role of government when it comes to natural disaster response, right? So that we can actually establish a proper metric of how to measure effectiveness, right? So what is the role of government during national emergencies as such?
Well, I think we shouldn't just start with the emergencies. What is the role of government? Two schools of thought emerge that the role of government is just to regulate and to provide an enabling environment for people to thrive. Another school of thought, which I tend to subscribe more to, is a government that steals from the people to give it back to them during times of emergencies when they are helpless. And that is what governments like the US do. They tax you so much that they have a big war chest, such that when there is a catastrophe, the federal government comes and tells you, you see, I exist to help you during these times. So it comes with a lot of relief. And then the rest of the time, when there is no emergency, it is engaged in accumulating through your taxes, through taxing you. So you see, the government must have the overwhelming power, like what the IRS here has, to get resources from the people. But then during the times of emergencies, it is able to give back those resources to where they are needed. Governments in Africa are incapable of doing that because the people do not have that which the government can steal or the government can bully them to getting. The little they collect is not enough even just to make the government run. And that's why every Kenyan, every government in Africa, including even Nigeria that has resources, is running on deficits. It is sustained by donor funds. The Kenyan government just about 2 weeks ago was thinking of redoing its budget to reduce expenditure by close to 350 billion because the taxes anticipated to be collected didn't get the mark. So even the government, without the emergency, without the flooding, didn't have enough just to run the normal functions that it had anticipated by the beginning of the year. So now you add the flooding, and the flooding is not just the immediate emergency and the need for countermeasures. It is also a fact that when it is flooding, industries are not operating, schools are not operating, farms are not operating. So if you think this emergency is bad enough, wait and see the weeks to come and the months to come. The effect of it will be catastrophic because any farm produce have already been destroyed. Most stores where agricultural product was being sold, even in government silos, they have all been destroyed. So even the rudimentary emergency kitty in terms of grain, in terms of food, in terms of agricultural equipment, probably has been destroyed. So we are likely to see a ripple effect of this that will be far more reaching than even the government itself is anticipating as we speak.
Wow. That's an interesting take, man. Hey, Arita, put a one in the chat if your question was answered. And as always here at DiasporUS, we got open forum questions. If you got a question to ask the professor, please put it in the chat. Just looking, shout out to Selena. Selena is asking, what does the government do with the money accumulated from us when there's no disaster?
You've been there to Nairobi. I understand you are in Nairobi just the other day. Chances are that the Airbnb that you slept in was constructed using stolen money. I can almost bet my last cent that that is it. All those buildings that you are seeing in Hurlingham, in Yaya Center, in Kilimani, the ones that have not even been occupied, these are buildings that are constructed to clean up money that government officials have stolen from the people.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, Arita is saying that's an interesting perspective. Um, and thank you, Selena, for your question as well. Arita, appreciate all of the chat involvement. Please continue to ask more questions, but next we're gonna dive into some of that a little bit, right? So, if this flood is going to cause a ripple effect. I know that you stated that we will see so much more in the coming weeks that will be sort of the domino effect that the floods caused. Can you talk a little bit more about uh, some of these issues and where should we start with trying to turn things back around and mitigating unintended consequences of this flood, while we also mitigate the intended consequences of or the known consequences of the flood, right? Um, and then we'll get back to the chat's questions. What are some of these things that we should look forward to in the upcoming weeks that are going to be very detrimental to the economy due to the floods and how we're handling it?
Let's start with just the water. The water now has mixed with sewer systems. So there is definitely likely to be cholera outbreak. And that will be a big thing because containing it with so much water will be impossible. Secondly, do you know doctors have been on strike? I think this is probably the 6th week. So the health sector is non-functional as we speak. So we are anticipating a lot of diseases coming out of it, yet the health sector is completely down. It is non-functional. So how are we going to address any disease outbreak with the doctors out? Secondly, food. This is supposed to be the time that most farmers are now preparing to put manure, to put fertilizers to their plants that they had grown probably a month and a half ago. But now they have all been destroyed. That means that the harvest that would have been done in the next 3 months is going to be delayed at best, not there at worst. The government finances are already running low. They are now non-existent. So how would they cater for these emergencies in terms of just food importation? Schools are closed. The government has not even given the schools the money that they are supposed to every beginning of the term, every beginning of the year. So money has not been disbursed. Parents who are supposed to foot part of the bill are the same parents who are not going to work, are the same parents who are not farming, are the same parents whose livelihood has been threatened by the same floods. Schools are flooded. So all this converge to make a really bad situation worse.
I see. I understand. Those are some very serious things. I did not know the doctors have been on strike for that long. Shout out to Sister I. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. You know, we've been talking a little bit about the floods. We got some more questions in the chat. So the first one is relating back to that question that is about what the government does with money accumulated when there is no disaster. We'll talk a little bit about US later on, but Arita is also asking, when does the stealing stop, right? So if Kenya is affected, and these same people who are stealing are also affected by the water, right? They're not exempt from this water. Uh, when does the stealing stop? Does it go back to that discussion that we had and have been having about that strong male leader that must come in and dictate. And is this a realistic goal to have? But let's address the chat's question real quick.
I mean, some wise person said there is always enough for everybody's need, but there is not enough for one person's greed. African leaders have shown such a high propensity for accumulation and for stealing and for corruption that one leader is just all it takes to steal everything. If you just were able to trace the money, just African presidents and their families have stolen and stashed abroad, you would be able to finance every government department, the entire continent. In fact, if you are able to trace this money and you are able to reclaim it, some of the developed countries would feel it, because this is the money that runs these developed countries, even the democracies. So Africans just steal, but unfortunately, they are the only thieves that are not patriotic. Almost everybody else steals and invests in their own country. African leaders do not even bank using African banks. They bank their money abroad. They don't even bank in their own currencies. They bank it in foreign currencies. And there is nothing worse than a non-patriotic thief. So they will steal as long as there is something to steal. And by the way, that is another characteristic of a peasant. A peasant is one who will have enough monies to finance everything that several of his generations will need, but still believes that there can be a time that he will be poor. And that's why he keeps on accumulating more, just to avoid that time coming.
I'm I'm still kind of hard pressed to understand why exactly there's no way to kind of audit, right? Where these funds are going and how it is how it is we can track and hold these leaders accountable. How do you track and hold leaders accountable when it comes to stealing their public funds? Will it take a, proverbial IRS, right, to come in and, track where these things are going? And let's prioritize the chat's question first. Shout out to C. I think this might be Clench, man. Shout out to Clench if that's you. Why is it said that African countries are corrupt when they steal, while the foreign countries that receive the stolen money are praised? Right. That is Isaac. Actually, that's Uncle. Shout out to Uncle, and that C is most likely Auntie Catherine. Thank you so much for joining. But that's a good question. So again, why is it said that the African countries are corrupt when they steal, right? But the foreign countries that receive that stolen money, that receive the banking, that receive these things, why is it that they're praised for having a certain level of investment? Is that simply a perspective thing? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it is just the basic principle. Anybody who does something that benefits you, you think he has your welfare at heart. Anybody who does something that doesn't benefit you, you think he did it on purpose. It is the thing that we have always had. But you see, this money is when they leave the country and they go abroad. They are part and parcel of foreign investment. This person has invested investments, when somebody invests in your economy, you hardly ask them where the money came from. In fact, forget about this money that is just stolen from the country. These Western powers give loans, and part of that loan is left in the giving countries, and the donor countries know this very well. In fact, some of the conditions for giving these loans or for giving grants is that only a percentage of it will go there. But to understand it well, and why there are no mechanisms for checking it, it is a question of non-transparency. Think of when you were last in Nairobi, the infrastructure was good. Much of it has been constructed by the Chinese. Nobody knows where the contract that the Chinese signed with the Kenyan government is, to even know how much money Kenya was given, whether a loan or a grant, to construct that road. If you traveled to Mombasa, you used the so-called SGR, Standard Railway Gauge. Nobody knows where that contract is for the construction of that line. So we do not know how much money it costs. We do not know how much it is going to pay. We do not know anything. During Kibaki's time, Thika Superhighway was constructed. Hardly anybody knows who gave the loan for that, what the terms were. So now, how do you put in checks and balances to check and balance something that you don't even know? You see, when the government decides to steal from you, it at one point acts as the prosecutor, the judge, the witness, the appellate court, and anybody that is required in the process to effect that.
I see. So, we got Sister I's reaction a little bit when she said dictatorship over democracy. Wow. You know, can you continue to expand on why democracy in Africa has been a failure, right? In a sense, I was actually talking to Bakari Kitwana, brother Bakari. Shout out to Bakari Kitwana for just being such a great mentor and helping me out with so many different things with the project and just trying to learn a lot more. But he mentioned a book, I think it was by Nyerere, right, about African socialism, right, and how some of these structures that are seen as Western ideals actually started and had their own African origin, right? Um, can you talk a little bit more about within the context of this flood, how a dictatorship or something that has or a form of leadership that has a strong leader would serve the people more than democracy in this state, right? So can you use the context of the flood to compare and contrast a dictator's response versus a democratic response in a natural disaster as such?
You see, a dictator commands probably every institution of the state, including the military. In fact, for a dictator to have been there, he needs to be in bed with the military, if not outrightly there.
That's
the military is true in
That's
Africa.
very true. If I can cut you off real quick, that's not just true, but it's also consistent with what we're seeing with Ibrahim Traore, right? Ibrahim Traore was not elected, right? He took power, he seized power militarily, and he started with that military control, and now he is making his rounds into the other elements of the institutions with a pretty clean slate. So far, what you're arguing is actually consistent. But continue. I just had to make that point.
If I were the dictator, the first thing I would do is all those buildings that are constructed in riparian lands, I will bring them down today, not tomorrow, today.
Those lands that lead
Those
the water
buildings that are constructed in waterways, I will bring them down.
so that the
Those
water can
public
flow. I
lands that
see.
have been grabbed, those public lands that have been grabbed, I will bring them down at the expense of the people.
Mhm.
I will by now have a list of the 100 most corrupt Kenyans, and I will confiscate everything that they have. With that alone, I will have enough resources to repair schools, pay the doctors to get back to treatment, to treating people. I will purchase medicines, because I will have also done away with the cartels that are making medicines not flow to government offices. I will issue a directive: if a doctor is not in hospital and he has no reason not to be in hospital, arrest them, take them to jail, and when they are in jail, let them treat prisoners.
So you're saying
A dictator can do that.
dictatorship is immediate action,
It is very effective.
whereas democracy has to take time to actually get the general populace's opinion before they can enact it.
And just imagine a situation. Do you know doctors are some of the best dictators? When was the last time you went to hospital and you started negotiating with a doctor on how to treat you?
I mean, it actually happens more often than not, especially with American healthcare, to be honest.
No. We're talking of real doctors who treat.
Yeah.
When did you, other than in some of these places, where did you find diseases have to agree with people that I'm only coming when you have an appointment? When you are sick in America, you can't see a doctor. You see a doctor when you are not sick. Now, how are the doctors treating you? You should be able to see a doctor when you are sick. So you see, these are some of the problems of democracy. Even normal things like seeing a doctor when you are sick. In fact, it is in America, it is when you are sick that you can't see a doctor, because you must make an appointment. Even when you go to the ER, you are only stabilized.
That's a very good point.
So you are only functional to the doctor when they are treating you when you are not sick. But when you are sick, most of the time you are just on your own.
I see. I see. Shout out to Mr. Malcolm. Shout out to Brother Thomas, man. Thank you so much. Another great mentor who's taught me so much over the years. Thank you for coming tonight. Um, you know, as we talk about how dictatorship would benefit Africa more than democracy, especially how it's implemented today, right? Um, some of these problems that we are seeing continue uh, and be snowballed due to our political infrastructure failing, like the flooding and like the subsequent issues that'll follow the flooding, right? Uh, you stated that Traore is has seized control, but is now entering into controlling the other elements in an immediate fashion. With a country like Kenya that has so widely already accepted democracy, and other countries that are like Kenya, right, where they're developing, they're using foreign investment, they're using loans from other countries like China. Um, where would they start when it comes to repairing some of the damage and corruption that leads to unintended consequences of natural disasters, right? Where would we start as a country in Kenya, or a country like South Africa, right? Or a country that's a little bit more developed and has adopted these westernized systems? I think they would give the most pushback to what you're saying, right? Whereas a country like Burkina Faso, not nearly as developed, so it has far less to lose when it comes to starting back from square one politically, right? How do you get a mid-tier country, that analogy where you stated, what's worse, starting at zero and making it to 50%, or starting at 99% and going backwards to 70%, right? What is how do you get a people to get down that path? Or, you know, it's a very difficult question I'm trying to ask, but you catch my drift a little bit. Where would you get Kenya or a more developed country to start to accept some of these ideas?
Yeah, you see, you are saying Kenya is a democracy, but the last 5 elections, there is no agreement on who won the elections. The most basic thing about a democracy should be the acceptance of a winner and a loser after elections. And once elections end, there should be acceptance that this side won, we ran short of it, we engage in national development in preparation for the next elections. Electioneering has become the dominant element of the so-called democracies, even in America. So now, electioneering, campaigning, and preparing for elections, declaration of candidature has become the preoccupation and the profession of most people. So, as they engage in campaigns and elections, production suffers a lot. And because of that, the economy shrinks. And there is no democracy that can survive with a shrinking economy, because democracy is sustained when people are happy. A good economy is a recipe for sustainable democracy. A bad economy cannot sustain democracy. People must see the benefits of democracy. The moment people don't see those benefits, they start demanding for change. When that change is not coming, because democratically it is supposed to come after a certain period, then you find people using other means to effect that change. And those means are most often violent in nature. And violence is the very threat to democracy. It is a vicious circle.
Wow. Wow. So,
And that is why you find the so-called democracy in these African countries is maintained through those corrupt practices. It is those corrupt practices that you allow your supporters to engage in, that they amass to buy their way to the next elections.
this also, I'm seeing, right, creates a culture not just of passivity, but also acceptance, where people accept corruption as a part of everyday life, so much so that they don't even care about their own moral compass to a certain extent, right? Um, you know, we've been talking about capturing the peasant, and how capturing the peasant, you have to get him to believe in himself and not look at an external force as a way to save himself, right? um how do you get a peasant to hold their leaders accountable, right, and ultimately hold themselves accountable? Let's talk a little bit more about that capturing the peasant, and how it pertains to a time like this, where, you know, Kenyans are seeing the results of their corruption, where now each and every individual Kenyan cannot escape this water, right? And
Let
it's
me give
symbolic.
you the relationship between the peasant and the leader of the peasant, who actually is just the same person. A Kenyan peasant voter believes that there is Kenya outside there that is detached from themselves. That Kenya is the one with the government. It is the one with the resources. So when they are electing a leader, when they are electing any representative, they are electing somebody from their locality who will go to that foreign place called Kenya, amass as much as possible, steal as much as possible, grab as much as possible, and bring it to them. And the best representative is the one who goes to that center, to that government, and gets as much for them as possible. And that is the development conscious leader that the peasants have. It is of somebody who goes to steal and brings them. It is technically like raiding. You getting the best raiders, they will go to raid the national coffers and bring it to you. As long as they are doing that, they are a representative. They are a good representative. In the 1970s and 1980s, representatives were considered to be intermediaries between the government with all the resources and the people who needed the resources. So the more your intermediary was able to get more from the national cake to the locality, the better a representative he was. It is that system that degenerated into, why wait to get a portion of it? Why can't I capture the government? Why can't I control the state such that I am the one distributing it and I just give my people a bigger cake? That degenerated into, because I need to win these elections, because I need to be seen by the developed countries to be democratic, how many people, how many of these communities do I need to bribe to be able to get a modicum of majoritarian rule? So now they redirect all state resources to that constituency that will enable them get the 50 plus one that will give them a majority. And then when they govern, how do I redistribute the national resources to a certain community, a certain clientele that will give me the support that I need to survive? And then as I'm surviving, I steal more to make sure that come election time, I am able to buy my way again. So you see how the peasant and the peasant leader, the peasant representative, just feed on each other until the person who gave you money today during elections becomes the person who steals for you for 5 years, only to give you a portion of it during the next elections. And because both of them are peasants, they are incapable of seeing how they are feeding into each other.
Wow, that's an incredible take. That, shout out to the chat. Shout out to Patricia Williams. She's stating, here in the United States, we've always seen a vast difference in disaster responses in underprivileged / black communities versus wealthier white ones. Um, that is an interesting and true take, especially because I remember, being real young and watching the Katrina responses, right? And especially listening to people like Ye have his sentiments on George Bush, right? We got that viral take where he said George Bush doesn't care about black people. Um, are there particular communities, the same way you stated that these communal representatives come to this national whole and try to take this cake back to their communities? I know after independence there were certain communities that got more resources for some reason or another, but now are there certain communities that get more aid during times like this, or is it specific to who has the most connections within government, right? So in a time like where there's flooding, are there particular groups that get more help, or get more money or get more flour or whatever resources that they need to help get them through this disaster? Based on what you just described, how are those resources distributed among the people?
Yes and no. I mean, right now we have divided the country into counties, and there is a certain percentage of the national resources that are distributed using a certain formula to counties. Using that formula, there are counties that get slightly more than others. There are those that are perceived to get more, but that is already constitutional, so that is fine. But then there is still almost 50 to 60% that is still controlled by the national government. And this one that is controlled by the national government and the policy element of it still redirect resources to certain communities. I'll give you two examples. Anytime they say they want to develop the coffee sector is dominated by one community. So any advantages to the coffee sector, which looks like a nationalistic thing, anything to the tea sector, again benefits another community. So you see, they don't have to direct resources to communities. They can target certain agricultural products. They can target certain sectors, knowing very well these sectors are dominated by certain communities. I'll give you an example. There is an agricultural finance corporation. This is a financial institution that gives loans to farmers. When there is drought, or like now when there is floods, they can say that we are going to forgive loans by coffee farmers. If that was to be done, it would benefit the Kikuyu because they are the ones who have that. If they say that because of the floods, we are going to forgive loans to the sugar industry, which has never been done, we know that will benefit the Luos because they are the ones in the sugar belt. If they say, oh, we're going because the horticulture industry has been affected, the flowers, we know this will go to the Rift Valley, Naivasha, Nakuru, where most of the flowers for export come from. So you see, they can make a policy that at the face of it sounds so nationalistic and sounds so apt to address a certain emergency, but technically it will be targeted to benefit certain elites or elites within a certain community. And they have done that historically.
Wow. That's you know, that's a tough thing to navigate, right? Because the more we discuss Africa's current climate, right, especially among the Bantu communities, in sub-Saharan Africa, the ones that haven't necessarily that may have had Arab influence, uh, mid 1400s all the way into the early 19s, but they're not necessarily Arab dominated, right? So these Bantu countries, I'm realizing that their nuanced issues, whether it be Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, they have the element of trying to balance democracy while also balancing their local governments, not just based on counties or other, you know, European forms of boundaries, but their ethnic groups. How does a dictatorship versus a democracy account for ethnic group politics better, right? How does one account for ethnic politics better or worse than the other? Would a dictatorship account for this tribal selfishness, which isn't necessarily good or bad, right? But it's just not good for a nation. Since we now have these nations, and we're not just tied to our ethnic group and general region, but we're tied to these nations that are based on borders that we necessarily didn't create, right? But we now have to operate in and now have gotten used to operating in. how would a dictatorship better serve these ethnic and communal wants and needs than with comparison to a democratic state?
You see this, that phenomenon that you are thinking is ethnic. It's actually not ethnic at all, and especially for the case of Kenya, it is
Well, I meant
absolutely
tribal,
not
right?
ethnic.
Tribal,
Even tribal, it is not tribal. Let me give you an example. A Kikuyu wants a strong government, and they want a strong government because they are scattered everywhere in the country. They want a strong government that can protect them wherever they are. Anybody who is scattered in different places will gravitate towards wanting a strong government that can protect them. The Kalenjin, because they are from a region that is the grain capital of Kenya, they want to control their locality because they are only spread within their locality. So they want to control their resources. They don't want to control their resources because they are Kalenjin. Any other community that has exactly the same characteristics will behave exactly the same way. But now, when you see somebody who is trying to protect what they have against encroachment by a government, you look at him and say he's a Kalenjin, so you think that is tribalism. It is not tribalism. So in Kenya, you need to peel, and most of Africa, you need to peel actually which layer can be identified as ethnic or tribal, which layer actually regional, because they just happen to be in a region that is good for coffee production. So when they are fighting for coffee prices, they are fighting as people who grow coffee, but because they happen to be from the same region, they also happen to speak the same language. So you only see the language, you don't see.
That makes, and that's such a thing that when you grow up in a melting pot like the US, right? That's not something that it's kind of a correlation causation thing, right? Where you're like, oh, this ethnic group is being favored or being, onewa,
exactly,
right? But really it's this region that also happens to have this large group of people, right?
Exactly. And it has a specific climatic conditions that predispose it to favoring or being able to grow these crops that have an international market. And because the government knows when they have access to international markets, the power of this group is going to increase. And if this group is identified with the opposition, you find when the government is all those in power interfering with the marketing of this crop or the production of this crop, you think the community is being targeted because of what they are, but that is not it. So there are several layers that you have to unpack to get exactly to what it is. And it is when people identify you, they are identifying you to discriminate against you. When you are being discriminated now, you also start now to identify yourself as the oppressed ones. And that is when you see some of these things coming. But when I told you that a shrinking economy cannot sustain democracy, that is what I meant. As long as we are all prosperous, we don't even need to be democratic, nobody cares. It is only when a few people have that everybody starts asking, how did they get it?
I understand, man. This is a very nuanced problem,
And that is why you find, if you look at the people who have been victims of assassination by various regimes, you still find among the Kikuyus Even when the leader was a Kikuyu, some of those assassinated were fellow Kikuyus. Your ethnic thesis cannot explain that.
Oh no, it wasn't my ethnic thesis. It was simply westernized understanding, right? Where we have this general understanding of tribalism that the West teaches us as a child of the diaspora, right? Where we
Mhm.
learn about our own country, not just from our own experience, but we get to learn what the perspective is that, pervades the educational system, the news, and our, immediate reach of information, right? And so, because we're not there to experience it personally, we still have to, kind of take that information just like a foreigner would, even though it's our home country. So, as children of the diaspora, it's very hard to learn about our country while not living in it, right? And so, some of the opinions that we gain, or some of the quote unquote facts that we gain, are from trying to do research while not really having that opinion that's not just has a PhD in political science, right? But somebody who lived there. And so that really is the reason why shows like this are now existing, right? Because we want to gain a bit more of a view from a non-naive perspective, and a more honest perspective that's less biased, right, through the filter that
I
is
didn't
Western media.
I didn't tell you, I don't know whether you remember that my PhD was actually in the management of ethnic conflict. I don't
Nah, I
think I
remember.
ever told anybody, I don't think I ever told anybody why I was drawn into that.
Mhm.
I I am married from a community that is not mine. And I have 3 children. And one time I found my 2 children, the last two, fighting because the son thought was from my community and was fighting the sister who said she's from my community because according to my son, my daughter needs to identify with the community of the mother and the son, the community of the father. And none of them had grown up in Kenya. So you see now, this is another level of constructing ethnicity that I had never experienced.
Mhm.
And this is how much of the ethnic conflict arises. It is just something that is constructed sometimes in ways that you would not have imagined possible.
I see. I see. So you know, before we adjourn, we've been in the chat, we've been in the stream for about an hour, 12 minutes now. Um before we adjourn, right? I know we've been really diving into this democratic menu, and the psychological milieu, right? Of what Africa is going through right now. Um and the environment is throwing in catalysts for change. The political climate is throwing in catalysts for change. There are so many reasons why these catalysts should come in, but us young people are aging into a level of responsibility that not only have we little experience with, right? But we're inheriting problems that we didn't cause, nor were we actually taught how to deal with, right? What would you tell young people that their first step is, if if we are to change some of these things, if your generation is aging, no longer in leadership, and you know power is shifting, what should us as young people prioritize when it comes to ensuring that we stay on the right track when it comes to eliminating the corruption, while also being wise enough to factor in these ethnic conflicts that we may not even fully understand, right? So how do us young people move forward from here, to handle things like this in the future?
You see, one thing that nobody tells you, and no political science class tells you, is that every democracy survives on the ignorance of the majority. As long as the majority are apathetic to the system, that system will survive. Secondly, as long as the majority of the people have no interest in the outcome, as long as you are comfortable, as long as you are satisfied, as long as whether A wins or B wins, as long as it will not impact you in any significant negative way, that democracy will survive. The problem with your generation and the problem with Africa at large is because it has made the clamor for democracy, the desire for elections, the most coveted profession ever. That they have brought on board people that should never have been involved in a democracy. My principle is simple. If you cannot feed yourself, you have no basis making a decision for anybody else. If you have no job, you have no basis for making a decision for anybody else. First of all, go get a job. When now you have a job and you can feed yourself, now you can start making decisions about what people to do with your money. When you bring fees to the democratic table, you bring people who cannot feed themselves to the democratic table. You bring people who have not even gone to school or who have nothing to the table. They are simply coming to make decisions over other people's resources. Remember, politics is all about distribution of resources. Unless you have resources, you cannot talk about distributing other people's resources. But now we have made democracy the occupation of everybody else. Everybody, even those who cannot survive on their own, they are part of that democracy. You want to bring them to the democratic table. And the only thing they can do is just overburden that table, and it will crack, it will break, it will collapse. And you see, they have nothing to lose other than their poverty. Democracy had always been an elite game of those with to protect what they have against those who do not have. And to be welcomed in it, you needed to show that you are capable of making it. Let's take democracy to its original path.
So you think that democracy should it or in its purest form is and you know honestly Plato and Socrates agreed as well. Democracy is a game for the elites, right?
Exactly.
Excuse me, I have to sneeze, right? Excuse me. But this game that is for the elites, then we've already agreed that you don't think it's something that will bring Africa forward. But
No. But you see now, when you make it for the elite, you are coming closer to a dictatorship, because the more you shrink those at the top, the closer you are to a committee or to a person. Because you see, dictatorship technically doesn't have to be one person. So the issue is to
isn't
bring
it by
back our
definition one
con.
person? A dictator is a singular. That's a singular noun, man. Wouldn't it be a rule by committee, or you know, it becomes something totally different if it's not one person, right?
No. You see, we are saying, rather than making the masses rule, the more you narrow it, the better you are getting, until you can get to what Plato calls the philosopher king.
The philosopher king.
And that philosopher king is a dictator.
I see. Kind of like Kagame.
A benevolent dictator is fewer better than a democratic leader.
I mean, a benevolent dictator is like there's a fine line between a benevolent dictator and a, a malevolent one, right? So there's a very thin line. It's easy to cross into that. Um, but good or bad all depends on which side you're standing on, in
I
terms
mean,
of,
I would call Kagame a good leader. I wouldn't call him a dictator. I would just call him a good leader.
yeah, I think that when it comes to leadership as such, I feel as though we have been led astray, and that we may not necessarily have the sentiment that dictatorships we actually have the sentiment that dictatorships are negative, and we never actually sat back to analyze their effectiveness, because I've seen their effectiveness economically in various countries, and so it's something that I think is worth more exploration, but more exploration based on someone who honestly really knows the subjects, right? Especially the pervading systems that were created against dictatorship, right? In essence, we were taught here that democracy and other systems were created to mitigate the issues that started from crazy psychotic dictators, right? And whereas we're also simultaneously taught to accept monarchies, especially European monarchies, as different from dictatorship, right? So they got a totally different PR than dictatorship, even though monarchies are essentially what a dictatorship is, right? Um, where you have one king, one queen, everybody else is below it. So, uh, why is it that we are taught that dictatorship is bad, yet the whole world, still venerated the queen, even though we established that Britain and the monarchy was a malevolent dictatorship, right? How is it? How do you get now? I know I said the previous question was the last question, but it's just such a great topic. How do we get people to accept uh, a new form of PR where, let's say, you're Traore's PR? How do you get his people to be comfortable with him and not turn against him, not just based on the results, but based on the education that they get in terms of priming their minds to be all right with it, the same way our minds were primed to accept the queen and to accept the monarchies of England or the monarchies of Europe, whereas we were taught to completely disregard a dictator like, quote unquote, dictator like Idi Amin, who we were taught to think of as crazy, even though he wasn't conquering other lands. He was just trying to rule his own, right? So can you talk about a little bit about how someone like Traore, right, within the context of someone like Traore, how does he now get his people to give him an honest or at least a fair appraisal in comparison to a monarchy of Europe?
No, why go there? You have Niccolo Machiavelli's prince. Might makes right, period. Conquer everybody. Develop the country. Start giving people the benefits. It is the outcome. As long as you are benefiting the people, they will be behind you. You don't even need to allow them to vote. As long as they can see the benefits, and as long as you are strong enough, because you see, there are those who will see the benefits you have created and they don't want to create anymore. They just want to get a bigger share of what you have made. So as long as you are strong enough to even conquer that one who is doing that and eliminate him, and then you making the most benefits and benefiting the most people, you don't have to worry.
I see. I see. We got a great question in the chat. Shout out Patricia Williams for this question. She's asking, do you think an historical examination of dictatorships would support such societal aspirations as equality, justice, and shared resources?
You see, all these are results of dictatorships. There is none of those things that didn't come as a result of a dictatorship. Let's take even the origin of citizenship and equality given to people who were not native to the land. This goes back to the Roman Empire. It is the Roman Empire that started giving citizenship. If you read the Bible, the story of Paul, when he was being imprisoned and asking them, is it okay for a Roman citizen to be sentenced without being tried? And everything froze when Paul asked that, because they knew how Rome would react when its own or somebody in its territory, somebody who demands for its protection, was to be sentenced without being heard. That was a dictator that protected the citizens that much. And we owe this idea of getting citizenship of other countries to that dictatorship of the Roman Empire. It is because your generation and many others have become intellectually lazy that they just consume what they are told by fellow teachers who are also intellectually lazy. It is dictatorships that gave us all this equality. Only a dictator will be strong enough to know, even if I made people free, they will not overthrow me. Democrats are very afraid of that, and that is why they are looking for all manner of manipulating elections.
I understand. That actually, it really makes sense, because when you look at the democratic issues that we see today, right, where the corporation ends up running a majority of the democratic processes due to their ability to donate and alter campaigns, right?
And the
Dictatorships
super
are,
PACs.
yeah, they're a dictatorship is really more honest. It's far
Exactly.
more
You see, that
honest, and
is
it's far more transparent, because
exactly. You oppose a dictator, you know what is going to happen. They are
exactly.
extremely transparent, but they're
However,
also transparent with the resources.
so this begs the question, and this is a great segue into the next episode, right? This means that anyone who may have a differing opinion from the dictatorship, that means that they are then subject to death. They're subjected to severe political punishment. How do you then, how because this is a sentiment that I have about at least capitalism, or the way that America is run, or the Western world. Ideas are still prioritized to the point where ideas will flourish. And capitalism does argue for ideas, and it argues for origination, and it gives a lot of I would say it gives a lot of points for that. It gives a lot of benefits for idea generation and idea execution. Whereas if you but that also means that you have to have the power to disagree, right?
Are you either intellectually dishonest or intellectually lazy?
Uh-huh.
Why did we eliminate Saddam Hussein? Why did we eliminate Muammar Gaddafi? Why did we eliminate all these other people who gave us ideas different from the petrodollar?
Mhm.
If you are saying that America is this place where alternative ideas are allowed to flow,
Yeah.
why is it that you can't become an American when you are communist?
Wow. Very true. No. That's not what I'm saying, right? I'm saying that it's true. What you're saying is true, but you're not killed for it, right? You're not killed for it.
Saddam Hussein just hid somewhere. Muammar Gaddafi just is living somewhere.
I mean, they arguably were not killed for their action, for their opinion. They were killed for their action, right?
They were killed for bringing an idea of establishing an African centered currency that is not the petrodollar.
Right, right, right. Very true.
So how different is that from just a dictator just suppressing everybody else?
I mean, it really is no different, man. It really is no different. I completely see your point. I'm just playing devil's advocate. I completely see your point. That's a that's a very sharp take. People, please bear with me. The cam has only has a certain amount of life, so that tells me we're going a bit over stream. But I know you can still hear me. Please put a one in the chat if you can still hear me. I know the imaging is gone. You guys are looking at the cam link, the insignia, but please put a one in the chat if you can still hear me. And thank you so much for coming out, Professor Pops. Dad, thanks so much for coming into this show again, and for giving us such game. But before we leave, what's on your mind, and how can we continue to get better? In three sentences or less, what do you think we should keep on our minds for the next episode, as it pertains to trying to change and capture the mind of the peasant, and we may be that mind.
Well, the question is, how are you not a peasant? Why are you assuming that the peasant is external to you? Why don't you look into yourself and see, how am I not a peasant? You see, our generation and some of us ask that question, and that is what brought us to the foreign lands, places where we had no idea how we were going to survive. But we knew, because we were not peasants, we were not confined to a village, to a tribe, to a community, to an ethnic group. We ventured elsewhere to try and conquer them and see whether we can either get a little bit polluted to dilute our peasantry, or to get other ways of getting out of that peasant mentality. So the question is, how is your generation? What is your generation doing, or what should your generation do now that you are products of people who were broken from it, to ensure that you do not reclaim that? How sure are you all these efforts towards having your foot now back in the continent is not your peasant relatives and your peasant blood that is drawing you?
Wow, wow. I see. Those are very tough questions to ask, man. I'm gonna maul over them. And again, thank you so much for just answering all these questions, and it's been an excellent show. Thank you so much, everybody, for popping in the chat, and for those of you who are going to watch afterwards. We fixed up the cam issues. Now we just got to fix up the battery issues. Each show is going to be better and better. This show was better than last show. Last show was better than the pre-recordings. Everything will continue to go, and we will continue to discuss Africa's future, surrounding various topics. Please email diasporusmedia@gmail.com if you want any more questions, if you have specific topics for the professor, if you got specific questions for the professor. Please email. That's diasporusmedia@gmail.com. Diasporusmedia@gmail.com. DIASPORUS media@gmail.com. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out, for asking wonderful questions. And Professor, just want to thank you one more time. Thanks for being here, and looking forward to your take on some more news for next episodes. We are going to have more frequent episodes as well, trying to get to minimum 2 a week, maximum around 4 a week, just so that we can have enough time to pre-plan and make sure we have prep time. But Thanks so much for joining us. Look forward to some new sound bites next stream. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day and stay blessed.
Okay, goodbye.